The room was quiet, filled with silence. Two figures standing near the hospital bed, one person is staring at the hospital floor, while his hand veins popped out. His knuckle turned white as he tightened his fist. He was sitting there with his legs spread while elbows resting on his thighs. The other one gazed at the person laying on the bed, unconsciously. But as the doctor walked, his eyes shifted to the doctor. The doctor stood in front of him. Is he all right? As the man asked it, the doctor placed his hand on the person's shoulder. Mr. Taehyung, your dad is out of danger, but he needs rest for at least 3 weeks. Due to a lot of blood loss, he is still unconscious. But don't worry, he will be fine soon. Taehyung glanced at Mr. John again before nodding to the doctor, while Jungkook was sitting on the table placed near the bed with dark eyes staring at the ground. He made a fist, uttering nothing but just sitting there quietly. The doctor added, but Mr. Taehyung, make sure to not stress your father about anything. He shouldn't take stress. He needs to rest properly. Taehyung nodded at the doctor. Don't worry, doctor. As long as we're with him, we won't let him do anything. The doctor patted Taehyung's shoulder before walking away. But he stopped when Jungkook spoke, still staring at the ground without looking at him. When can we take him home? The doctor turned it back. Well, Mr. Jungkook, your dad needs rest, so it's better to keep him here for 3 weeks. Jungkook, 1 week. Later, I will take him home. Either you will discharge him or not, cause I don't trust the security of yours, he said, lifting his head. Jungkook spoke in his cold tone, looking at the doctor. He was so angry that he forgot how to talk with the person who treated his father. Taehyung, Jungkook, he said, looking at Jungkook, speaking with his eyes, telling him to stop being rude. Jungkook just scoffed and looked away. Taehyung then shifted his gaze to the doctor, who doesn't seem bothered by Jungkook's tone. Taehyung, don't mind him, Dr. Shin. He's just worried but doesn't know how to express it. Taehyung said, looking at the doctor, placing his hand inside his pocket. Mr. Shin chuckles. Never mind, I got used to him. He's the same from childhood. Remember how he shouted at me when he was just 10 for taking out the bullet from Mr. John's arm? He's always sensitive about his father. Taehyung chuckles with the doctor when he remembers, while Jungkook scoffed. Jungkook, you don't have to bring that now, in a low voice with an expressionless face. Mr. Shin, he just shook his head and looked at Taehyung. If you want, you can take Mr. John home after 5 days. But still, he needs rest at home. He shouldn't work. Taehyung nodded at Mr. Shin. Mr. Shin looked at Jungkook, who was looking at his father with an expressionless face. Don't worry, gentleman, your father will be fine. Mr. Shin said before leaving the room. As soon as the doctor left, Jungkook and Taehyung tone become serious and their eyes become dark to see Mr. Jeon in this state, while their hatred towards the person behind all this just grew deeper. Jungkook, Dad is weak now. If we keep him here, then Thor's buster try to attack him from everywhere. We will be taking Dad home after 5 days. Taehyung nodded. Let me just find the reason behind this all. Jungkook, I swear I'm gonna swim in their blood, he said, gritting his teeth while his jaw clenched and hand make a fist. Taehyung, let him rest. Jungkook stood up before looking at Taehyung and then at his dad. Dad is injured, but doesn't mean we're stopping for whatever we are doing. At first it was your problem, but now it's ours, Jungkook said. Jungkook, he tried to hurt my dad. I won't let him go that easily. Taehyung, we are not stopping until we find the cowards behind this all game. And Mr. Jeon is my father too. Jungkook did a light note. Jungkook, obviously, and us, brothers, are gonna find the cowards soon. Jungkook and Taehyung looked at each other before shaking hands. Taehyung, very soon. Both brothers walked out with their usual cold faces. Jimin and other members were waiting for them. Namjoon and Yoongi were sitting on the chair, spreading their legs while resting their elbows on their thighs. Jim and Jin were standing leaning against the wall, with their hands folded to their chest, while Hosek was calming Mrs. John, placing his hand behind her back respectfully. As soon as they saw Taehyung and Jungkook exiting, they pushed themselves off the wall, while other members stood from their seats. Jimin, how is Uncle John? Is everything fine? He asked while his tone is serious yet worried. He looked between them, waiting for them to answer. Jungkook, he is out of danger, but it takes some time to recover. Jimin breathed in relief. Mrs. John sighed in relief while Hosok smiled brightly, looking at her and rubbing her back in a respectful way. Hosok, see mom, everything is fine, right? I said right. He smiled at Mrs. John. Mrs. John, you know how much I was scared? She said, covering her face, trying to hide her puffy eyes from crying. Jungkook walked to his mom. Mom, he's fine, don't worry. He gave her a light hug which Mrs. John gladly accepted. Mrs. John, can I go inside? She asked, looking at Taehyung. Taehyung, Mom, don't worry, he's still unconscious. He needs some rest and he will be fine. But for now, we can't go inside, he said, holding his mom's shoulders. Mrs. John, fine, but I told your dad many times to drive safely, she complained, looking at Jungkook and Taehyung with her dry voice from crying, while all of them chuckled, finding her cute in some way. Taehyung, don't worry mom, dad is strong, he's alright. He hugged her. Taehyung, but this time it's not dad's fault, he mumbled, resting his head on his mom's shoulders while his eyes darkened. He broke the hug and turned, looking at the members. Taehyung, how is Mr. Choi? Did anyone know? He looked at the members. Namjoon, me and others are with Wyan and Yoon. We were waiting for you. Yoongi, I heard he had less injuries than Mr. John, so don't worry. Both Jungkook and Taehyung looked at each other, hearing Yoongi before nodding. Mrs. Choi and Yoon were sitting on the couch placed in the corner of the hospital room. They were having a worried look while the doctor gave an injection to Mr. Choi, who is still unconscious. Wan was sitting on the table placed beside the bed. She looked at her father with an expressionless face. She looked down at his hand, holding it with her right hand and placing her left hand on it. She lifted her head up, looking at the doctor when he was about to say something. Doctor, don't worry, Mrs. Vine, your dad is totally fine. But as he lost his blood, he needs some rest. Thank God he got less injuries than Mr. John. Vine, when will he wake up, doctor? She asked, still holding her father's hand. Doctor, in a few hours he will be cautious. Don't worry, he's out of danger now. Vine, thank you, doctor. She gave him a light nod. Doctor, it's my duty, Mrs. Vine, and let Mr. Choi get some rest. Vaya nodded. The doctor gave a light smile before exiting the room. Yoon, thank God, she said, holding her mom's hand and leaning against her shoulder. Mrs. Choi looked at Mr. Choi with a worried face. Vaya looked at his dad before slowly removing her hand from his. Rest well, Dad, she said before standing up and walking to Yoon and her mom, who was sitting behind her on the couch. Let Dad get some rest, Mom, she said, looking down at her mom. Mrs. Choi stood up and gave a light hug to Vine, which she returned back. Jun, we were so scared, she said, standing behind her mom. Wan, he's fine, don't worry, she said, giving a side hug and rubbing Yun back while Yun just nodded. Wan, let dad rest some time, she said, looking between Yun and Mrs. Choi. Yun, Mrs. Choi glanced at Mr. Choi before nodding. Yun Wan and Mrs. Choi walked out, while the girls spoke, walking towards them. Jenny, how is Uncle Choi? She asked, looking at Yun. Yun, Dad is fine. The doctor said he needs some rest. Fine. What about Mr. John? Is he alright? She asked, looking at the girls while they just stared at each other. Mia, the guys are with them. We hope he's alright. Emma, when Mr. Choi is discharging? Why, doctor said he needs 2 week rest, but it's maybe not safe to keep him here. Jimin, don't worry, Ryan. We will be taking home Mr. Choi and John after 5 days. They will take proper rest at home. As Jimin said, everyone else's attention goes towards him. Mrs. John and Mrs. Choi side hug patching each other. Jungkook and Yoon just look at each other while Ryan spoke, looking at Taehyung. Ryan, how is Uncle Jeon? Taehyung, he is out of danger, but he needs some rest. What about Mr. Choi? Ryan, that is fine, but the doctor said he need to take some rest as well. Taehyung nodded, while Jungkook spoke from behind. Jungkook, Mom and Mrs. Choi, you both are awake from last night. I think it's better for you to go home and take some rest. Yoon, he's right, Mom. You both didn't even sleep last night. Mrs. Choi and Mrs. Jeon looked at each other, but Jungkook, no buts, Mom. Han, he called his guard who was standing behind him. His guard stepped forward, standing beside Jungkook. Drop them at home and careful. Han gulped before nodding after hearing Jungkook's words, which he spoke in a husky tone. Jimin, and my precious ladies, you all should leave with Mr. John and Choi. Me and members have some important work. Mrs. John, what work? No, I'm sure you're gonna cause trouble. Jin and John, we will be safe, don't worry. Go home and take some rest. Stop stressing, he said, smiling at her, while Mrs. John gave a poker look. Jenny and John, let's go. You also have to eat something. And Mrs. Choi, come with us to Mrs. John home. Mrs. Choi, but Taehyung, don't worry, Mom. We will take care of Mr. Choi and Dad. While looking at Taehyung as he called Mrs. Choi Mom, Mrs. Choi gave a light nod. Imma, let's go, beautiful aunts, she said, cheering their mood while they just chuckled at her. The five girls walked with Mr. John and Mrs. Choi, but Wine and Yoon stood there. Taeyong and Jungkook frowned their eyebrows. Taehyung, why are you not going with them? Wine, let me come with you, she said, stepping forward. Yoon, me too, she said, stepping forward as well. Both Jungkook and Taeyong glanced at each other before looking back at them. Jungkook, are you kidding? You're not coming with us, he said, looking at Yoon with glaring eyes. Yoon, trust me, I won't cause any trouble. We just want to help you. Wine, let us go with you, she said, looking at Taeyong. He didn't say anything but just looking at her, trying to read her curiosity. Jimin, but Wine, it's not safe. Wine, we are with you, right? She said, gazing at Jimin before looking at Taehyung. Wine, right? Taehyung looked at her before smirking, which is unnoticed by anyone. Taehyung, right, he said before turning and walking. Wine followed behind him. Jungkook, Hyung, are you seriously? He said in disbelief, looking behind at Taeyong and Bayan. He turned his head front just to find Yoon smiling mischievously. Jungkook, no. Yoon, yes, she said while he just signed in frustration. Jungkook, fine. He turned while she walked behind him. Other members chuckled at them, shaking their head before leaving behind them. Taehyung, Bayan walked in front while other members were behind them. When they walked towards their car, they saw guards were standing near their car with a straight face, while Michael standing there with a bandage around his forehead. He was wiping the blood from his lips. As soon as Michael and other guards saw them, they bowed. Taeyong spoke, looking at Michael with his hands in his pocket. Taehyung, are you alright now? Michael nodded. Tell me what exactly happened last night when Mr. Choi and Dad were returning. Michael, after finishing work, Mr. John and Mr. Choi were returning home in the same car. I was driving the car while Mr. John and Choi were having a conversation on the back seat. But suddenly, a truck came in our way. Jungkook, but why does Dad and Choi have more injuries but not you? He asked with his hand in his pocket, with raising his eyebrows. Michael, I was struggling to handle the steering wheel and try to pull the car aside, but accidentally I hit a tree. I fell off the car on the ground, but Mr. Choi and John were still inside the car. Taehyung, what about the truck? Taehyung asked, raising his eyebrows. Michael, I stood up struggling, but when I looked at the truck, it already left pause. Jimin, so a truck, huh? Taeyong, it is surely the same person, he said, darkening his eyes as he remembered his parents had died in the same way. Jungkook, let's go to the accident place. Taehyung, Michael, come with us. Michael nodded. Sure, boss. The members sat in their own cars while Jungkook with Yoon and Taehyung with Wine. A guard sat on the driver's seat in another car. Since Michael couldn't drive, he sat in the passenger seat, showing the location of the accident.